So there's a general misunderstanding going around at the moment that the function you value the most must automatically therefore be your dominant function. This is not true, not even in the slightest bit. In fact, it is possible for us to value any of our 8, let's say, speaking in extremes, cognitive functions more than any of the others. This is why I created the social archetypes of CPT. A social archetype refers nothing more to the portion of identity that overlaps with the relation to a specific modality of thought. We tend to form our first social archetype during the initial adolescent identity forming process. And while most people jump from one social archetype to another as their life evolves and progresses, it is very much possible for a person to keep the same social archetype throughout the course of their life. And indeed, it is this individual who is more likely to consistently receive the same type result from any given MBTI test. Because of course the average MBTI test will look at the functions you value and assign you your type based upon that score. You may hear the term superego get thrown around a lot these days. Most of the time you'll hear it within this particular typological community. It will be used, in my opinion, incorrectly. The superego is not a fixed series of functions within your particular cognitive type. It actually has no direct relationship to your cognitive functions. The relationship between the superego and your cognitive functions is actually indirect. Very loosely speaking, the superego tends to be that part of the psyche which has absorbed the values instilled into you from your initial subculture, from your parents, from the social circles you kept at an early age, all the way up to the very norms of the society you exist within. There is a highly collectivistic attitude to the superego, as opposed to the ego, which is much more intrinsically individualistic. And you can see now why both of these forces within the psyche tend to be of an opposing nature. So no, a set series of cognitive functions within your stack are not your superego. However, the social law around you when you were growing up during that initial identity forming period can very much determine your social archetype. And that is the cognitive function, irrespective of your type, that you value the most. For example, my first social archetype was of the convergent auxiliary position. Having grown up in a highly individualistic subculture, as a part of, indeed, an individualistic society at large, I found my individuality through internalized logic, with introverted intuition in an egoistic sense playing a much more supportive role to the agenda of my introverted thinking. What are the implications of this? Well, in cognitive terms, I remained an INFJ, an NI dominant, but the axis between my dominant and convergent auxiliary was much more fluid. And thus in those situations whereby I was taking charge of my identity and acting out my archetype, I was oftentimes doing so from a TI dominant position. But emphasis there on acting out. Your social archetype generally only comes into such an extreme level of play under extreme conscious supervision. My dormant state was still very much an introverted intuitive dominant, which I'd say I spent about 70 to 80% of the time in. Did online tests at the time give me a TI dominant score? No, they still gave me an INTJ score, which is the type I most consistently received up until about the age of 25, because again, these tests were not measuring cognitive functions, they were just measuring the dichotomies, and I was still very much a judging type. Furthermore, in that 20% of the time I mentioned, it would have been much more close to an ISTP state than it would have been an INTP state. And moving on, about 10 years down the line, as I began to really take charge of my life and decide what was meaningful to me and actually place an additional amount of concerted effort into realizing my goals, the orientation of my social archetype effectively reversed. And as such, the function I valued the most and instilled most of my identity into became extroverted thinking. And to this day, this remains my social archetype. I very much value my extroverted thinking even above my introverted intuition, because it is through extroverted thinking that I achieve the results that I desire. And again, about 20%, even 30% of the time, these results, this exertion of order according to my own desires into the external world, is of an even higher value to me than internal reflection and reformulation of that vision. And this has, in some instances, especially whereby tests have in some ways focused more on cognitive functions than they have the dichotomies alone, led me to consistently receive an ENTJ result. And even in the tests that I attribute to about 50% accuracy, which is, to be honest, pretty good for an online test, I received this result because the tests are measuring what functions I value. And within an MBTI paradigm, introverted intuition is secondary to extroverted thinking within the ENTJ. But cognitively speaking, and I'd say at least 70% of the time, my dormant state is that of an INFJ. Because the function I value and overlaps most with my current identity is the reverse orientation of my convergent auxiliary. And these two social archetypes I've mentioned are relatively rare, particularly the last one in the case of the reverse orientation of the convergent auxiliary. Why is this? Well, generally it takes quite an intense individual to identify with their convergent auxiliary because this is the function that requires the most conscious activation. And as such, the identification of the ego with this function will coincide to a large degree with responsibility for the self. Not necessarily insofar as a self-growth mindset is concerned, but more to do with just a general desire to feel in control of yourself. And as such, the ENTPs who model themselves on extroverted feeling, the ENTJs who model themselves on extroverted sensing, the ESFPs who model themselves on extroverted thinking, generally all of these people will have a high degree of internal intensity. Not in terms of introverted cognitive functions, but in terms of relation to the self. And as such, this particular archetype might be more common in an individualistic culture. However, there are many factors, too many factors to bring into account here, that influence your social archetype. And not all of these factors are going to be superego related. Yes, an INFJ in a more collectivistic culture might value their extroverted feeling more than their introverted thinking. Yes, an INFP brought up in a particularly strict household might value their opposing function of extroverted thinking more than any other. And indeed, an INTJ, let's say for this instance, who lives a particularly secluded existence and likes to have routines built around them, while also desiring to precisely lock in to any specific details and even distrusting their own introverted intuitive abstractions, might even build a social archetype upon introverted sensing. And conversely, an ISTJ in exactly the same position might build an archetype upon introverted intuition, having to always have a sense of exactly where things are going and requiring life to have a kind of monotonous predictability, while compensating for the lack of tangible concrete experience in their life with wild leaps of the imagination in their internal world. So a social archetype isn't always a good thing. It doesn't always coincide with a positive mindset. You may have heard in more contemporary MBTI settings, people talk about being in the group of the inferior function. This can be in some instances a social archetype built upon the oppositional function. So generally speaking, our first social archetype, and of course we can accrue many different social archetypes across the course of our lifetime, is highly influenced by superego elements, and is generally a combination of nurture and nature. Generally speaking, the social archetype I currently possess is relatively rare, and it in no way, shape or form demonstrates an excellent employment of that particular function. While I have been on the individuation journey for some time, I still do not consider myself a proficient user of extroverted thinking, but I still value the function, and I'm happy to dedicate a lot of time and effort into its effective employment. And it is relatively rare for a person of any given type to identify with a function which is more often than not unconscious. And generally speaking, as the antagonist of the authority function, the opposite orientation of the convergent auxiliary tends to get very little light of consciousness. This is because in the case of the INFJ, for example, for as long as extroverted feeling is activated, extroverted thinking is generally suppressed. And even dipping into the function from the extroverted feeling position requires an environment of relatively low stress. However, when alone, it is much easier and more comfortable to engage introverted thinking than it is the opposite orientation, extroverted thinking. And as such, you can see why this particular function isn't very intuitive to engage in a conscious manner. And it is important to remember social archetype is not a subtype. There is no singular way in which a function will be expressed relative to the degree to which the ego identifies with it. And it will tend to coincide with a convergent employment of that function. So for example, as long as an individual has their social archetype constructed upon any one of the opposing functions or their different orientations, they will be engaging that function in a more convergent manner than they would otherwise. For example, one of the most common social archetypes, that is the shadow divergent auxiliary archetype, the function in question being the opposite orientation of the authority function, the individual will oftentimes be activating that function from the dominant position. And as such, for as long as that function will be consciously and deliberately employed, rather than just fallen into, there will be a level of convergent attitude. An INTJ in this state will be coming up with original thoughts and theorem. An ESFP or ENFP in this state will be bouncing off other people in a social atmosphere. An ENTP will be going down a rabbit hole of research, and an ENTJ will oftentimes be bouncing ideas off other people. Generally, a social archetype that is built upon a reverse orientation of the dominant function tends to coincide with age, because as we grow older, particularly in the cases whereby we pay less active attention to maintaining all of our cognitive functions, our cognitive stack actually tends to neutralize. And as such, the SE dominant tends to mellow out and become much more SI oriented, and extroverted intuitive dominants tend to focus all of that abstract energy more internally, oftentimes accruing a kind of holistic wisdom. Similarly, many ESTJs and ENTJs tend to become deeply theoretical, and introverted feeling dominants can even become more actively communal. And while this is somewhat of a segue, I would want to mention on the back of this, cognitive neutralization is still not necessarily a good thing. Because while accessing the opposite orientation of your dominant function does become more viable, the overall realm of influence does essentially halve. So you have difficulty dipping into either extreme. Whereas if your cognitive stack was less neutral, you'd be more gravitating around one extreme, but you'll still have access to the other extreme. And as such, your range of cognitive influence is still greater, even if it is slightly more uncomfortable to access either side. And yes, to an extent, while social archetype can indeed influence the degree to which you can use one function over another one, we generally acquire much more freedom than we would from a social archetype from simply adapting in a healthy manner to the ongoing concept around us. Learning new skills, stepping outside your comfort zone, starting a completely different hobby or vocation, for as long, of course, as it is pragmatic and healthy. Challenging our cognition, learning skills which our dominant stack isn't necessarily intuitively set up for. All of these things can drastically increase the plasticity of our cognition. And the more we continue to challenge ourselves and step outside of our comfort zone, while ensuring to hold on to the things that we love, ensuring to hold on to the things that lead to a healthy environment, both internally and externally, can over time erode that portion of our cognitive predisposition which is no more than habit. Because yes, while cognitive type does exist, while all of us are probably born with a certain inclination towards a specific thinking style, just as we are born towards an inclination towards one hand over another one, over time we cement these habits. Over time, especially when granted autonomy, we tend to expect our environment to mold itself around us rather than vice versa. We go into a job that feels comfortable. We befriend people with the same general values as ourselves. And much of the original identity we construct during adolescence is formed upon our most innate and instinctive cognitive predispositions. So a large portion of this cognitive type concept is just habit. And as we unlearn these habits, the pathways towards opposing functions of even opposing attitudes and orientations become far more accessible. Our cognition becomes more fluid, and generally this journey will coincide with a high degree of individuation, because the opposing forces within the psyche tend to lose that kind of antagonistic relationship, with a complementary relationship taking its place. So what specific activity, what specific job, what specific people? It completely and utterly depends upon your type. Let's take, for example, an ESFP. This person followed what could be argued to be their natural cognitive predisposition and entered the field of self-help. They valued their own self-transformation, and they wanted to share that journey and impart the skills they have acquired in that journey to other people. They took to the stage, they developed a charismatic presence, and they began sharing their experiences and words of encouragement with other people. But as one step led to another, this individual suddenly started engaging in talks with various dark web, if you like, intellectuals. But it just so happened that this individual's words happened to coincide perfectly with the ideology of a certain political party. And an opportunity was presented to this individual to share their particular wisdom on a broadcasting association of a particular political persuasion. The numerous affiliates of this institution benefited from the words of empowerment, the message of individualistic responsibility this ESFP was sharing with other people. And while this developed the ESFP's career, political bodies span that particular sentiment in order to gain support for legislation this particular individual may not have actually wanted to back in the first place. But now this individual has to enter the political spectrum. They have to suddenly start considering a myriad of different components. and all of the different possible future ramifications for saying X over Y. And let's say, for argument's sake, in order to adapt to this particular challenge, the individual who had already to an extent developed a kind of fluidity between their dominant function and their conversion to auxiliary had to spend as much as 40% of the time, especially when on stage, in a relatively ENTJ-like state, rotating as they did their dominant auxiliary axis. However, over the years of various forms of political activism, if you like, this individual began to burn out. They accrued a certain level of, let's say for the sake of argument, cynicism, or perhaps just simple skepticism. They grew tired of duplicity, they grew tired of corruption, and they grew tired of the compromises which are oftentimes necessary in order to make any kind of meaningful change within a oftentimes gridlocked society. This individual became political commentator / philosopher. And perhaps this individual, who was by the way still an ESFP, began to tread towards writing what would become a best-selling book. A book which blended certain forms of political ideology with an underlying existential philosophy which touched upon the pursuit of happiness. The state of this individual was fluidly now rotating between, let's say, ESFP, ENTJ, INTP, and INTJ. And for the sake of argument, let's throw some ISFJ in there too. The book did really well, but what people really liked about it was the individual message they took from it. It was a message of optimism. It was a message taking the power back to the individual. The ESFP in question had come all the way back to that self-help vocation they started in the first place. However, this time with much more success. This time with much more accrued wisdom and fluidity within their cognitive stack. Having that cognitive fluidity, they were much more easily able to relate to the positions of other people. And rather than supplying a one-size-fits-all equation and crude hacks and shortcuts, they were recognizing that every person is an individual. And to a large extent, because of this journey, they'd become much more individuated as a result. And now this individuated individual wanted to empower others with that same individuation. This is a rather hyperbolic example of how circumstances can essentially change the way you interact with your cognition. And indeed how acquiring more fluidity within your cognitive stack can equip you better to handle vocations which would not necessarily have been instinctive in the first place. So yes, in response to positively adapting to an ever-changing world around us, we can to a large degree transcend our cognitive stack. And for more information on the concept of the transcendent function, I highly recommend checking out this video here. So I hope that video was useful, and be sure to share it with anyone who you think might benefit from it. If you enjoyed it, be sure to let me know by leaving a like down below. It really does help the channel grow, develop and reach new audiences. And if you haven't already done so, be sure to click that subscribe button down below with the bell icon next to it, that way you can stay notified of future content. For those of you interested in the social archetypes and reading more of the underlying theory behind CPT, I highly recommend checking out the CPT ebook. And they also offer a dedicated CPT type service as well. And finally, CPT is now on Patreon, so if you're interested in supporting the theory on that additional level, that would be massively, massively appreciated. But of course, it goes without saying, I already massively appreciate your support over this medium as well. So thank you again for watching, thank you again Sarah for that request, and I'll be back in a few days' time. For now, take care of yourself.